Greetings and welcome to another Tomorrow's World webcast. It's wonderful to have you here. My name is Wallace Smith. This news has been making the rounds. Keep hearing little updates here and there, even from the time I record this to the time you see it. There may have been more. But I'm going to read an article from the Washington Post, May 9th, by Philip Bump. I'm not going to read the whole article, just selections. The title is, "Did Facebook Bury Conservative News? Ex-staffers Say Yes." I'll give you the gist of it. There is this understanding that some staffers from Facebook, actually Gizmodo, believe it or not, was the source that really broke the story on this. They claim they've been filtering out conservative news or pro-conservative news and news sources and letting more liberal news pass through to the Newsfeed on Facebook. Let me just go ahead and read selections from the article. It says, what we're talking about here is that little box in the upper right of your Facebook page, the short list of news topics that are being discussed on Facebook at the moment. The company uses an automatic system, an algorithm, to surface what's currently popular, and a team of staffers then further curates the list to tailor it to meet particular standards. So there is a definite human level of involvement. And they write, and there's the problem. Gizmodo quotes several former curators suggesting that conservative news stories would be booted from the automatically generated list of trending stories for two reasons. Essentially, they say if it came from a conservative site, a purely conservative site, they would often then try to find the same news item in more mainstream sources. I would assume, like, say, the New York Times, the Washington Post, perhaps, or something like that. Then it says the other reason was if the curator didn't want to include the story or didn't recognize the story as important, just on the curator's personal judgment, though it was apparently popular, if he or she didn't want to include the story or didn't recognize it as an important story. One of the whistleblowers says, I believe it had a chilling effect on conservative news. Let me just read just a few more items, not too much more to get a good gist of the story. You really ought to check it out at the Washington Post. They write, it's significant in part because it's the most obvious manifestation of what Facebook wants you to see. That is, the trending news relates to what Facebook wants you to encounter as one of their users. They point out the trending news on Facebook is content that Facebook is choosing to share with you. And it also says that apparently in other instances, the curators would inject a story into the feed even if it wasn't trending, that they would actually insert a news item because they personally seem to think it was important or so, again, based on this article. They write here, now this really is fascinating if you understand the scope of Facebook and why this is a concern for some people. They write, any news organization, including the Washington Post, and I'll give them credit for this, this is a Washington Post article and they're making this point. Any news organization, including the Washington Post, is subject to bias introduced by the people that work for it. I would say the people who work for it, but who am I to judge? They write, hand tailoring what the trending news algorithm spits out introduces bias. Not that the algorithm itself is without any bias, given that it too is cobbled together by humans. But that bias affects an audience of a size that the Post could only dream about. Their point being that even though the Washington Post themselves are certainly subject to bias, and I appreciate their admitting that, they point out that when it comes to Facebook, approximately 1/6 of the planet visits Facebook on any given day, based on their numbers they provide here. 1/6 of humanity, apparently, visits Facebook regularly for such items, and that is a vast audience to have a group of people deciding what news they'll be presented and what news they will not. Just to wrap up, one more statement. They say nearly 3/4 of American adults who use the internet use Facebook. And those adults didn't see stories about political topics in their trending news feeds because a human who works at Facebook decided not to show it. That's all I'll read from the article. It's worth a read if you find it on the Washington Post. Do go check it out. I'd like to make some commentary, though, here as we wrap up. First, let me say, duh. You know, our news is filtered in a lot of ways. On one hand, this should be obvious. The idea that there's some sort of perfect system that doesn't filter news and just keeps giving us the facts, that's ridiculous. That's a fantasy. On the other hand, though, it's a good reminder that we are fed the news we get, regardless of the source we choose. I don't care if you're a Fox News fan or an MSNBC fan, we are fed news by people who decide that news is important. None of us go out and actually get the news ourselves. None of us hear about an accident or a shooting or an approaching weather system and in all these cases go out and gather the facts ourselves. We are fed. There are gatekeepers. And it's really interesting, actually. Ezekiel chapter 22 and verse 25 and 28 talks about a conspiracy of prophets in the midst of Israel that give false visions and such. They were like gatekeepers of information from God to the people, and they weren't always giving good messages or clear messages either. That's certainly the time that we live in today. And so we should remember that what we're being fed by the media is always filtered. You can't avoid that bias. But we should also inject a little personal humility as well. Jeremiah 17:9 reminds us that the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? One of the greatest filters of news into your mind is you. One of the greatest filters of the news that goes into my mind is me. All of us have a tendency to cherry pick the things we want to hear and the things we don't want to hear. What God is looking for are those who are open to all the facts, even when they're uncomfortable. That's it for us here. Thanks for watching, and check out everything we have at tomorrowsworld.org.